On March 24, 2026, Iranian-backed militant forces launched a coordinated strike against key infrastructure targets in the United Arab Emirates, marking the first time in over 3 years that Tehran has directly authorized attacks against a nation formerly allied with the United States under mutual defense agreements signed during the Abraham Accords. The assault targeted critical desalination facilities near Abu Dhabi and oil export terminals in Fujairah, systems that process nearly 40% of the UAE's freshwater supply and handle approximately 1.8 million barrels per day of crude oil exports bypassing the strategically vulnerable Strait of Hormuz. What makes this development genuinely unprecedented is not merely the audacity of striking American-aligned infrastructure, but the response that followed from former President Donald Trump, who within 18 hours of the attack issued a statement that appears to have caught both the Biden administration and regional allies completely off guard. Trump declared that any further Iranian aggression against Gulf allies would be met with what he termed immediate and disproportionate consequences once he returns to office in January 2027, effectively establishing a parallel foreign policy framework that directly contradicts current State Department messaging emphasizing diplomatic de-escalation and renewed nuclear negotiations with Tehran. The statement creates an extraordinary situation where adversaries and allies alike must now calculate their strategic moves based not on current American policy, but on anticipated policy shifts under a future administration still 10 months away from assuming power. The immediate question facing military analysts and regional observers is not whether Trump possesses the authority to make such commitments while out of office, which he clearly does not, but whether Iran and Gulf allies will nonetheless modify their behavior based on anticipated rather than actual American policy. This represents a fundamental disruption to the normal functioning of deterrence frameworks, which depend on clear, unified messaging from recognized governmental authority rather than competing signals from current and future leadership. The UAE now faces strategic calculations about whether to escalate defensive postures and retaliate against Iranian proxies based on current Biden administration guidance counseling restraint, or to prepare for a dramatically different American approach that Trump's statement suggests would support more aggressive responses. Meanwhile, Iranian military planners must assess whether the remaining 10 months before a potential policy shift represent a window of opportunity to achieve strategic objectives before facing a substantially more hostile American posture, or whether Trump's statement itself constitutes a deterrent signal that should modify Iranian calculations even during the current administration. Understanding why this particular attack carries such profound strategic significance requires examining the careful balancing act that has characterized UAE foreign policy since the Abraham Accords normalized relations with Israel in 2020. Abu Dhabi has attempted to simultaneously maintain its security partnership with Washington and Tel Aviv while pursuing economic de-escalation with Tehran through diplomatic channels and reduced involvement in Yemen's civil war. The UAE withdrew most combat forces from Yemen in 2019 and has carefully avoided becoming a staging ground for Israeli or American operations against Iranian nuclear facilities, precisely because Emirati leadership understands that their critical infrastructure, particularly the desalination plants that provide fresh water to a desert nation of nearly 10 million people, represents an easily accessible target for Iranian retaliation. The March 24 attack suggests that Tehran has decided this careful balancing act no longer serves Iranian strategic interests, and that the UAE must face consequences for its alignment with Israel and hosting of American military assets at Al Dhafra Air Base. The tactical details of the March 24 strike reveal significant evolution in the capabilities Iranian proxy forces can now deploy against hardened infrastructure targets throughout the Gulf region. According to reports from Emirati defense officials, the assault involved a coordinated salvo of approximately 15 Shahed 136 loitering munitions, the same Iranian-designed one-way attack drones that have proven devastatingly effective against Ukrainian infrastructure throughout 2024 and 2025. These weapons, designated by NATO reporting standards as kamikaze drones, combine a 50-kilogram high-explosive warhead with a range exceeding 2,000 kilometers and a radar cross-section so minimal that detection by conventional air defense radar proves extremely difficult until the final moments before impact. The UAE operates a sophisticated integrated air defense network built around American-supplied Patriot PAC-3 batteries and the locally developed Falaj-2 system, But defense analysts note that these architectures were optimized for detecting and intercepting conventional aircraft and ballistic missiles rather than small, slow-moving autonomous platforms approaching at extremely low altitude. Emirati military sources indicate that defensive radar systems detected only 6 of the 15 incoming Shahed 136 platforms in time to attempt intercept procedures, with successful engagements achieved against 4 of those 6 targets. The remaining 9 drones struck their intended targets with what defense analysts describe as concerning precision, suggesting that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, or its proxy forces, operating the systems, possess detailed intelligence about facility layouts and critical vulnerability points. The desalination plant that sustained the most severe damage reportedly processes over 150 million gallons of potable water daily for Abu Dhabi's population, with repair timelines estimated at 6 to 8 weeks to restore full operational capacity. The Fujairah oil terminal damage appears less extensive, with UAE officials claiming that export operations continue at reduced capacity. But the psychological impact of demonstrating that Iran can strike energy infrastructure that Gulf allies had considered protected by American security guarantees carries strategic significance far beyond the immediate economic disruption. The weapon systems employed in this strike represent a particularly troubling development because they exploit a recognized gap in the defensive architectures that Gulf allies have invested tens of billions of dollars to construct over the past 2 decades. Traditional air defense networks were designed to counter the threats that dominated military thinking during the Cold War and immediate post-Cold War periods, including high-performance fighter aircraft, cruise missiles launched from ships or aircraft, and ballistic missiles following predictable trajectories that allow calculation of intercept points. The proliferation of cheap, mass-producible autonomous drones that cost perhaps $20,000 per unit but require million-dollar interceptor missiles to defeat creates an economic equation that fundamentally favors the attacker. Iran can potentially manufacture hundreds or thousands of Shahed 136 platforms, at costs totaling perhaps $15 to $30 million. Forcing defenders to expend Patriot missiles costing $3 to $4 million each, or risk allowing strikes against critical infrastructure to succeed. This asymmetric cost dynamic means that sustained drone campaigns can potentially exhaust defensive inventories and create windows of vulnerability even against nations with substantial financial resources and American military backing. The evolution of Iranian proxy warfare strategies over the past 5 years demonstrates increasingly sophisticated operational planning that integrates multiple attack vectors across extended campaign timelines rather than relying on isolated dramatic strikes. Defense analysts, examining the March 24 UAE attack within the broader context of Iranian-backed operations throughout the region, note a consistent pattern where initial attacks probe defensive responses and capabilities. Subsequent operations exploit identified vulnerabilities or resource constraints, and final phase strikes target high-value infrastructure once defensive degradation has been achieved. This campaign approach was visible in the 2024 Houthi attacks against Saudi oil facilities that followed similar progressive escalation patterns in the 2025 militia operations against American bases in Syria and Iraq that systematically degraded detection capabilities before launching larger assaults, and now appears to be emerging in operations against UAE infrastructure following months of lower-intensity harassment that may have been designed to map defensive capabilities and exhaust interceptor stockpiles. The geopolitical implications of this attack extend well beyond the immediate UAE-Iran bilateral relationship to fundamentally challenge the credibility of American security guarantees throughout a region where multiple allied nations host substantial American military infrastructure based on assumptions that such hosting provides protection rather than attracting retaliation. The UAE maintains Al Dhafra Air Base, which houses American F-35 fighter squadrons, tanker aircraft supporting operations throughout the Middle East and Central Asia, and intelligence collection platforms monitoring Iranian military activities. Qatar hosts the forward headquarters of United States Central Command at Al Udeid Air Base, the nerve center for American military operations across 20 nations from Egypt to Kazakhstan. Bahrain serves as headquarters for the United States Fifth Fleet, maintaining naval supremacy throughout the Persian Gulf and protecting the shipping lanes through which 20% of global petroleum supplies transit daily. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Oman all host American military facilities under agreements predicated on the assumption that American presence deters adversary attacks rather than inviting them. The March 24 strike against UAE infrastructure, despite the presence of American military assets stationed less than 100 kilometers from the targeted facilities, raises profound questions about whether hosting arrangements that made strategic sense during periods of American military dominance still provide security benefits in an era where adversaries possess sophisticated standoff capabilities and apparent willingness to test American resolve. Regional partners have begun expressing concerns through diplomatic channels and media statements that American security commitments may no longer offset the targeting risks created by hosting foreign military infrastructure. According to reports from diplomatic sources in Gulf capitals, private discussions between regional leaders and American officials have grown increasingly tense regarding what level of Iranian aggression would actually trigger substantive American military responses versus continued emphasis on diplomatic engagement and de-escalation. These alliance tensions are further complicated by the apparent divergence between current Biden administration policy and the approach that Trump's March 25 statement suggests a future Republican administration would pursue. Biden administration officials have consistently emphasized diplomatic engagement with Tehran, including renewed efforts to negotiate constraints on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief and normalization of economic relationships. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's public statements following the UAE attack called for restraint from all parties and offered to mediate disputes through diplomatic channels, characterizing the incident as an opportunity to address underlying grievances through negotiation rather than military escalation. This approach reflects a broader strategic framework that views military confrontation with Iran as potentially catastrophic for regional stability and global energy markets, particularly given ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and tensions with China over Taiwan that stretch American military resources across multiple theaters simultaneously. Trump's statement rejecting this diplomatic framework and promising immediate and disproportionate consequences for Iranian aggression represents a return to the maximum pressure campaign that characterized his first administration, including withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action nuclear agreement, reimposition of comprehensive economic sanctions, and the January 2020 targeted killing of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. The statement specifically referenced Soleimani's death as an example of the approach Trump would pursue, suggesting that future Iranian attacks against American allies would face responses targeting Iranian leadership and military command structures rather than proportional strikes against proxy forces or infrastructure. This creates an extraordinary dynamic where Iranian military planners must simultaneously calculate responses to current American policy that emphasizes restraint while preparing for a potential dramatic shift toward confrontation that could materialize within 10 months. The economic dimensions of this escalating tension carry implications extending far beyond the immediate parties to the conflict through potential disruptions to global energy markets that remain highly sensitive to Middle Eastern instability despite diversification efforts over the past decade. The UAE produces approximately 3 million barrels of crude oil daily, representing roughly 3% of global supply. But the nation's strategic significance derives primarily from its role as a major refining and trading hub processing petroleum products for global distribution. More critically, approximately 21 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products transit the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula that represents the most critical choke point in global energy infrastructure. Iranian military forces possess substantial capability to threaten shipping through the strait using anti-ship missiles, naval mines, swarm attacks by fast patrol boats, and coastal defense systems that could potentially close the waterway for extended periods. The vulnerability of Gulf energy infrastructure to Iranian retaliation creates a fundamental tension in American and allied policy calculations where aggressive responses to Iranian provocations risk triggering escalation spirals that could produce catastrophic economic consequences through energy supply disruptions. Previous Iranian threats to close the Strait of Hormuz have been met with American promises to maintain freedom of navigation through military force if necessary, but the credibility of such commitments depends on assumptions about American willingness to sustain potentially extended military campaigns against hardened Iranian defenses while managing simultaneous global commitments. The March 24 UAE attack suggests Iranian confidence that American deterrence has weakened to the point where limited strikes against allied infrastructure will not trigger the devastating military responses that previous generations of Iranian leadership feared. This calculation appears to rest on Iranian assessment that the American political environment following years of Middle Eastern military commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan has produced deep public skepticism about new regional entanglements that would constrain any administration's freedom of action regardless of rhetorical commitments. Iranian leadership may judge that Biden administration reluctance to escalate reflects genuine domestic political constraints rather than merely preferred diplomatic approaches, and that even a future Trump administration would face similar limitations despite aggressive campaign rhetoric. However, this assessment could prove catastrophically miscalculated if Trump's statement reflects genuine intention to pursue dramatically different approaches rather than mere political positioning, or if the Biden administration itself decides that continued Iranian testing of American resolve requires stronger responses to preserve broader deterrence credibility with adversaries in Moscow and Beijing, who are closely observing American reactions to regional challenges. The fundamental strategic question emerging from the March 24 attack and Trump's subsequent statement is whether the international system can sustain stable deterrence frameworks when competing power centers within a single nation issue contradictory signals about future policy directions and red lines. Traditional deterrence theory assumes that adversaries and allies can reliably predict how specific actions will be met based on clearly communicated commitments from recognized governmental authority. The current situation where Iran must calculate strategic moves based on divergent signals from current and future American leadership creates dangerous ambiguity that could produce either excessive caution that prevents Iran from pursuing legitimate security interests or excessive risk-taking based on miscalculation about how severely the United States would actually respond to major provocations. Gulf allies face equally difficult calculations about whether to prepare defensive postures and retaliation strategies based on current American guidance or anticipated future policy shifts that could leave them exposed if they guess incorrectly about which approach will actually govern American behavior when crises escalate. The UAE's response to the March 24 attack has thus far been notably restrained publicly, with officials condemning the strikes and calling for international pressure on Iran while avoiding military retaliation against Iranian proxy forces or infrastructure that might trigger wider confrontation. However, diplomatic sources indicate that Emirati leadership is urgently seeking clarification from both current and potential future American officials about what level of support they could expect if Abu Dhabi chose to respond more aggressively to demonstrate that attacks against critical infrastructure carry unacceptable costs. The absence of clear answers to these fundamental questions creates a power vacuum where adversaries may calculate that the next 10 months represent a strategic window to achieve objectives before American policy potentially hardens, while allies worry that restraint during this transitional period could invite further attacks without guarantee that promised future American support will actually materialize. Iranian military planners may conclude that additional strikes against Gulf infrastructure could degrade defensive capabilities and create facts on the ground that would constrain future American responses regardless of which administration holds power, while also testing whether Trump's statement represents genuine commitment or merely rhetorical positioning without substance. The trajectory of this crisis over the coming weeks and months will likely determine whether the international system can maintain stable deterrence during periods of domestic political transition within major powers, or whether such transitions create dangerous windows of uncertainty that adversaries will inevitably exploit. The fundamental question is not whether Iran possesses the capability to strike additional targets throughout the Gulf region, which clearly it does, but whether Iranian leadership believes that the potential benefits of further escalation outweigh the risks of triggering American responses that could devastate Iranian military infrastructure and economic systems regardless of which administration ultimately delivers them. The answer to that calculation will shape not only the immediate security environment in the Persian Gulf, but potentially the broader patterns of international conflict and deterrence throughout an increasingly multipolar global order where competing power centers must navigate complex webs of alliance commitments, domestic political constraints, and adversary capabilities that make traditional strategic planning increasingly uncertain and dangerous.